Nora Blaine had one piece of bread left in the world, and she broke it in half and gave the larger half to the Lakota war chief, who had not spoken to a soul in 3 days. It was the hungriest winter anyone at Fort Reunion could remember. The buffalo had not come, the freight wagons had not come, and the relief that the government had promised had not come either. So the settlers and the displaced Lakota bands and the drifters had all washed up together at the old post by the frozen river, a few hundred starving people sharing one hard truth, which was that there was not enough food to go around, and everyone knew it, and everyone had begun to guard their small portions the way a dog guards a bone. Into that guarded, hungry silence, Nora Blaine did a thing that made no sense. She was sitting near the great fire in the middle of the post yard, and across from her sat a Lakota man, tall and still and alone, a man everyone gave a wide berth. She did not know yet that he was a war chief named Cetan. She only knew that he had the look of a man who had not eaten in longer than she had, and that his eyes, when they lifted, held a hunger that was not only for food. So Nora took the last piece of bread from inside her coat, the piece she had been saving against the worst, and she broke it, and she leaned across the frozen ground and held the larger half out to the silent Lakota man. "Take it," Nora said. "You need it more than I do. Go on." The whole fire went quiet. People stared. A white widow did not share her last bread in a famine, and certainly not with a Lakota man that everyone had learned to fear. Cetan himself did not move for a long moment. He looked at the bread, and then he looked at the thin young woman holding it out, with a hand that shook from cold and hunger both, and something crossed his hard, still face that had not crossed it in 10 years. He did not know it yet. Nora did not know it yet. But that broken half of a last piece of bread was about to undo a vow that a grieving man had kept for a decade, and it was the beginning of the only love that either of them would ever call by its true name. To understand what a piece of bread could do to such a man, you have to know who Cetan was and what he had sworn. Cetan was a war chief, and among his own people, he was respected the way you respect a mountain, from a distance, with a kind of awe that leaves little room for closeness. He had led his band through the hardest years, through the soldiers and the broken treaties and the long retreats, and he had kept more of his people alive than anyone had a right to expect. But a man pays for that. Cetan had paid by turning himself into something hard and closed, a man who felt everything and showed nothing, because a leader who breaks cannot lead, and Cetan had decided long ago that he would not break where his people could see. For 10 years, the matchmakers and the elders had tried to bring Cetan a wife. It was not right, they said, for a chief of his standing to have no woman and no children, no one to tend his lodge or carry his line. They brought him widows and maidens, women of beauty and women of skill, women who would have been glad to share the life of such a man. And Cetan turned every one of them away, gently, with respect, but without any opening for argument. 10 years of refusals. The people had stopped understanding it. Some said his heart had died in the wars. Some said he was married to his duty. Some said he had simply gone cold all the way through. None of them knew the truth, because Cetan had never spoken it. He carried it behind his still face, the way he carried everything, alone. He let them think him cold. Cold was easier than the truth, and it kept people at the distance he needed them to keep, because Cetan had learned, in the cruelest way a man can learn it, that to love was to hand the world a knife and bare your throat, and he had decided he would never bare his throat again. So he sat by the fire at Fort Reunion, in the hungriest winter of his life, alone inside a crowd, a war chief who had turned away every woman for 10 years, and a starving white widow leaned across the frozen ground and offered him the last of her bread and asked nothing, and the wall that 10 years of refusals had built began, very quietly, to crack. The winter that brought them together was the kind that people name and remember for the rest of their lives. It had started with a failed hunt. The great buffalo herds that the Lakota depended on had not come south, driven off by the hide hunters and the railroads, and by the time the bands understood how bad it would be, the snow had already closed the country. The settlers fared no better. Their crops had been thin, their stores were low, and the government agent who was meant to distribute relief had either stolen it or lost it, or simply failed, the way such men so often did. So a few hundred souls of every kind had gathered at the old post by the frozen river, drawn by the rumor of food that never quite arrived, and they settled in to endure a winter that was going to kill some of them, and everyone knew which fact was true, even if no one said it aloud. That was what made Nora's bread so remarkable, and why the whole fire went silent to see it. In a place where sharing had become nearly extinct, where a scrap of food was a matter of life and death, a starving young widow had broken her last piece and given the bigger half to a stranger. It was either the most foolish thing anyone at the post had done all winter, or the bravest, and the line between those two things is often very thin. Cetan knew which it was. That was the thing. A lesser man might have seen only foolishness. But Cetan had spent his life keeping people alive in hard winters, and he knew exactly what that half a piece of bread had cost the woman who gave it, and he knew that she had given it anyway, to him, a stranger she had every reason to fear. And the knowing reached a place in him that 10 years of careful armor had failed to protect. Nora Blaine had no more reason to be generous than anyone else at Fort Reunion, and better reason than most to be hard, which makes what she did all the more worth understanding. She had come west 3 years before, as a young bride, full of the ordinary hopes. Her husband, a gentle man named Thomas, had died in their 2nd year, not dramatically, just an infected wound that would not heal, the quiet way the frontier killed so many. Nora had been left a widow at 24, with a failing claim, and no family within 1,000 miles. She had held on as long as she could, and when the hungry winter came, and the claim could no longer feed her, she had done what the desperate did, and come to Fort Reunion on the rumor of relief. Grief and hardship had not made Nora hard, and that was the center of who she was. She had every excuse to close herself off, to guard her scraps, to look after her own survival, and let the rest of the world freeze. Plenty of people at the post had made exactly that choice, and no one could rightly blame them. But Nora had discovered a thing about herself in the years since Thomas died. She had discovered that the only way she could bear her own loneliness was to keep her heart open to other people's. That kindness given was the one thing that made her feel alive rather than merely surviving. So she shared what she had, even when she had almost nothing, because closing herself off felt like a second death, and Nora had already died enough for one life. The bread she gave Cetan was, truly, her last. She had been saving it for the worst day, and she did not know how she would eat the next morning without it. But she had looked across the fire and seen a man whose hunger was in his eyes as much as his belly, a man everyone avoided, a man who was starving alone in the middle of a crowd, and Nora Blaine could not, in the end, look at that and do nothing. It was not a calculation. It was simply who she was. She expected nothing back. That is important. She did not give the bread to soften the fearsome Lakota man, or to make an ally, or to be seen being good. She gave it because he was hungry and she had bread, and in Nora's understanding of the world that was the whole of the matter. And it was precisely because she wanted nothing back that the gift reached Cetan as no calculated kindness ever could have. Cetan took the bread. He ate it slowly, the way a starving man eats when he is trying to make a small thing last, and Nora watched him and was glad, and then she looked away to give him the dignity of eating without being watched. And that small courtesy, the looking away, undid Cetan almost more than the bread itself, because no one looked away for Cetan. No one gave him dignity. They gave him fear and distance and the awe you give a mountain, and behind all of it, a wariness that never quite let him be simply a man. For 10 years, Cetan had been a war chief, a symbol, a thing people needed or feared, and somewhere in those 10 years, he had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as an ordinary, tired, hungry person by someone who expected nothing from him. Nora had handed him bread and then looked away so he could eat in peace, and in doing so, she had treated him, without knowing it, as a man rather than a chief, and the simple human decency of it cracked something in Cetan that all the matchmaker's beautiful candidates had never touched. When he had finished the bread, Cetan spoke, for the first time in 3 days. His voice came rough from disuse. "Why did you give me this?" he asked. "You are starving. I watched you save that bread for a week. I have watched everyone at this fire guard their food like wolves. Why would you give your last to a stranger, and to a man your people teach you to fear?" Nora considered the question honestly. "Because you were hungry," she said, "and I had bread. That is all. My husband used to say that the measure of a person is what they do in the lean season, not the fat one. Anyone can be generous when they have plenty. I would like to think I am the kind of person who can still be generous when I have almost nothing. It is the only thing I have left that the winter cannot take from me. So I gave you the bread. Do not make it more than it is." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. And Cetan sat by the fire long after Nora had gone to her shelter, turning her words over. The measure of a person is what they do in the lean season. He had spent 10 years measuring himself by what he could endure. He had never once thought to measure himself by what he could still give. And a starving widow had just shown him, with half a piece of bread, that the second measure was the one that mattered. The vow that Cetan had kept for 10 years had been made on a night he never spoke of, and to understand the man, you must understand that night, though he would have told it to no one. 10 years before, Cetan had been a younger man, with a young wife named Takawin, and a small son who was just learning to walk. He had loved them the way a man loves when he has not yet been taught caution, completely, holding nothing back, certain in the foolish way of the young that the people you love are permanent. He had been away, leading the men, when the soldiers came to his camp in the cold. By the time Cetan rode back, the camp was ash, and his wife and son were among the lost, taken by the soldiers' fire and the winter that finished what the fire began. He had held what remained of his family in his arms in the snow, and he had made, in that hour, the only vow a shattered man knows how to make. He swore he would never love again. He swore he would never stand where he had stood that night, holding the center of his own life gone cold in his arms. He could not prevent loss. He had learned that lesson in the cruelest way, but he could prevent himself from ever having so much to lose. A man who loved no one could not be destroyed by losing anyone. It was the arithmetic of a man trying to survive the unsurvivable, and it had worked, after a fashion. Cetan had survived. He had led his people through 10 more years of hardship, and he had done it as a walled fortress of a man, feeling everything, showing nothing, refusing every woman the matchmakers brought, because each of them was a door back to the snow and the ash and the cold weight in his arms. He had made his peace with it, or told himself he had. He expected to grow old behind the wall and die behind it, a respected chief and a hollow man, and he had stopped imagining any other end. The wall had kept out the cold for 10 years. He had forgotten, the way a man forgets, that it also kept out the fire and the warmth and everything that made the enduring worth doing. And then a starving widow had reached across a famine fire with half a piece of bread and treated him like a man instead of a mountain, and looked away so he could eat with dignity. And Cetan had felt, for the first time in 10 years, the wall he had built begin to fail. It frightened him more than the soldiers ever had, because Cetan knew exactly where the failing of that wall would lead, and it led back toward the snow, toward the risk, toward the bared throat and the handed knife. And for the first time in 10 years, a part of him did not want to rebuild. Cetan did not know how to court a woman. He had spent 10 years unlearning it. So he did the only thing he did know how to do, which was to keep people alive in a hard winter, and he turned that skill, quietly, toward Nora. It started the very next day. Nora woke in her cold shelter to find, just outside the flap, a rabbit, cleaned and ready, more meat than she had seen in a week. There was no note, because Cetan could not write and would not have known what to say, and there was no one in sight. Nora understood at once who had left it, and why, and she understood too that a proud man who did not know how to say thank you had said it in the only language he had. She cooked the rabbit, and she ate, for the first time in days, until she was not hungry, and she saved a portion, and that evening at the fire, she found Cetan, and set the saved portion down beside him, without a word, the way you return a kindness among people who do not need to speak of such things. That was how it went. Through the deep of that terrible winter, Cetan hunted, and he was the best hunter at the post, and where before he had shared his kills with the band at large, now he made certain, quietly, that Nora ate. And Nora, who could not out-hunt him, repaid him in the ways she could, mending his worn moccasins with her fine, even stitches, saving him the warm place by the fire, sitting with him in the long, cold evenings, so that neither of them was alone. Neither of them named what was happening. Naming it would have been too large, too frightening, for a widow who had buried one husband and a chief who had walled himself up for 10 years. So they fed each other, and mended for each other, and kept each other company through the killing months, and let the thing between them grow in the spaces where words were not required. The post noticed, of course. A post in a famine has little to do but notice. People remarked on the strange pairing, the fearsome Lakota war chief and the gentle white widow, and some of the remarks were ugly, because hunger makes people ugly. But Cetan had a way of going still and silent that ended such remarks quickly, and Nora had a way of simply not hearing them, and the two of them went on through the winter, quietly keeping each other alive, and slowly, without either of them deciding it, keeping each other's hearts alive too. It was in the coldest, darkest part of the winter, when the famine was at its worst and the weak were dying, that the wall Cetan had held for 10 years finally came all the way down. Nora fell sick. It was the fever that came through the crowded post that winter, the one that took so many of the already starving, and Nora, thin and worn from a hard season, caught it badly. She lay in her cold shelter burning and shivering, too weak to tend her own fire, and she might have died there alone, the way so many did, a widow with no family to sit beside her. But Cetan would not have it. When he learned she was sick, the war chief who had refused every woman for 10 years moved into the entrance of her shelter and did not leave her side for 6 days. He built her fire high. He melted snow and got water past her cracked lips. He traded 3 of his precious rabbits to an old healer woman for medicine, and he gave Nora the medicine drop by drop through the long, fevered nights. He did for Nora exactly what he had not been able to do for Takawin 10 years before, when he had ridden back too late to a camp of ash. He sat through the dark hours when her breathing went thin and frightening, and he willed her to live with everything in him, and somewhere in those 6 days, the vow he had kept for a decade simply dissolved, because you cannot sit at the sickbed of someone you are terrified to lose and go on pretending you do not love them. The fever broke on the 6th night. Nora opened her eyes near dawn to find the war chief beside her, gray and hollow with exhaustion, having not slept in days. She was too weak to speak. She only reached out and found his hand, and Cetan took it and held it, and for a long while, neither of them said anything at all. "You should not have stayed," Nora whispered at last. "You could have caught the fever. Your people need you. You should not have risked yourself for me." "I have spent 10 years not risking myself for anyone," Cetan said, and his voice was not steady. "I made a vow, after I lost my wife and my son, that I would never love again, so that I could never lose again. I have kept it for 10 years. I kept it against every woman they brought me. And then you gave me half a piece of bread in a famine, and looked away so I could eat with dignity, and I have not been able to keep it since." He tightened his hand around hers. "I could not sit outside your shelter and let you die alone, Nora. I have already lived once through arriving too late. I will not do it again. The vow is broken. I broke it days ago. I only did not have the courage to say so until now." Nora mended slowly, the way the starved and fevered do, and as she grew stronger, the thing between her and Cetan could no longer be hidden or unnamed, and the people of the post and Cetan's own band had a great deal to say about it. The band did not like it, and their reasons were not simple prejudice, though there was some of that. Cetan was their war chief. For 10 years they had wanted him to take a wife, but they had wanted him to take a wife of the people, a Lakota woman who would strengthen the band with ties and children of their blood. To have him finally, after 10 years, open his heart at last to a white widow with nothing, a woman of the very people who had burned his first family and were even now starving them off their lands, struck many of them as a wound rather than a joy. The old women who had brought him candidates for a decade were scandalized. Some of the men muttered that the chief had been made soft or foolish by hunger and grief. An elder took Cetan aside, as an elder had every right to do, and spoke plainly. "You refused our own daughters for 10 years, the old man said. "Women who would have honored you. And now you would take a white woman, when it is white men who took your first wife from you? I do not understand it, Cetan. Explain it to me, because the people are troubled." Cetan did not flinch from the question. "I refused your daughters," he said, "because I was afraid, not because I was proud. I lost Takawin and my son, and I swore never to love again, so I could never lose again. Every woman you brought me was a door back to that grief, and I shut them all." That was not honor. That was fear wearing the mask of honor. He paused. "As for her being white, I have hated white men. I have every reason to, but I sat at a famine fire, hating, walled up, and a white woman who was starving gave me her last bread and asked nothing. Hatred is a wall too, elder. It kept me safe, and it kept me hollow." She reached through it with a piece of bread. "I will not throw away the one thing in 10 years that has made me feel like a living man, because it is inconvenient to the people. I have given the band 10 years of a hollow chief. I would like to give them, At last, a whole one. The turn came in the last hard weeks of the winter, and it came, fittingly, over bread again, though this time the stakes were far larger than a single piece. The relief wagons finally arrived at Fort Reunion, too late for some, in time for the rest. But there was not enough. There was never enough, and the agent in charge of distributing it was a corrupt and frightened man who meant to give the food only to the white settlers and let the Lakota bands starve, calculating that no one important would care if they did. Word of it ran through the post, and it was a death sentence dressed as an oversight, and the Lakota, weak and outnumbered, had no way to fight it without bringing soldiers down on themselves. It was Nora who fought it. Nora, still thin from her fever, walked up to the agent in front of the whole gathered post and the newly arrived soldiers, and she did the thing she did best, which was to refuse to let cruelty pass quietly. "These people are starving," Nora said, loud enough for every soul and every soldier to hear. "You mean to feed some and let the others die, and you have decided which by the color of their skin. I have wintered at this post. I have watched these Lakota families share what little they had when your government sent nothing. That man there," and she pointed at Cetan, "hunted to keep half this post alive, white and Lakota both, while your relief sat in a warehouse. I will not stand here and watch you starve the people who kept us alive. Feed everyone, or explain to these soldiers and to God why you chose to let children die, to save yourself a little trouble." The agent blustered, but the soldiers were listening, and some of them were decent men who had not signed up to watch children starve, and the plain force of Nora's words, spoken by a white widow the agent could not easily dismiss, turned the moment. The food was shared, all of it, to everyone. Nora had given her last bread to one hungry man at the start of the winter. At the end of it, she gave a whole post's worth of bread to a whole people, and this time the stakes were hundreds of lives. Cetan watched her do it, and whatever last small piece of his wall still stood came down for good. When the food had been shared and the crisis had passed, Cetan came to Nora, and the whole post seemed to be watching, because a whole post loves nothing so much as the end of a story it has been following all winter. "You gave me your last bread when we met," Cetan said, "and today you gave my whole people their lives. I have spent 10 years believing that the way to survive was to give nothing, to love no one, to keep my throat covered so no one could cut it. You have proved me wrong all winter long. You gave everything, over and over, with nothing held back, and you are the most alive person at this post, and I have been the most hollow for all my careful surviving." He took a breath. "I made a vow 10 years ago never to love again. I broke it the night I sat outside your shelter, and could not let you die. I am done with the wall, Nora. I would rather risk losing you than spend one more winter safe and hollow and alone. Marry me, be my wife. Let me spend whatever years I have left learning to give the way you give, instead of hoarding the way I have." Nora, who had buried one gentle husband and thought that part of her life was finished, looked at the war chief, who had turned away every woman for 10 years and had broken a decade-long vow for her, and she did not have to think long. "When I gave you that bread," Nora said, "I told you not to make it more than it was. Do you remember? I was wrong. It was more. I think some part of me knew it even then, that I was not just feeding a hungry man. I was reaching for the first person in 3 years who made me want to stop merely surviving and start living again." She took his hands. "Yes, Cetan, I will marry you. I have been alone since Thomas died, keeping my heart open out of stubbornness, because it was all I had left. I would rather keep it open with you than alone. Yes, Cetan and Nora were married when the spring came, and the ice broke on the river, and the band that had been troubled by the match came, slowly, to understand it. The old women who had scandalized came around first, as old women often do, once they saw how Nora gave herself to the life of the camp, sharing and mending and nursing with the same open hand she had shown at the famine fire. The men came around when they saw that their war chief, whole at last, led them better than the hollow man had. Cetan had been a good chief for 10 years out of duty and grief. He became a great one out of something else, because a man who has remembered how to love has more to fight for, and fights harder, and his people felt the difference the way you feel the sun after a long winter. They had children in time, and Cetan held them, and did not let the old fear of losing tell him not to love them, because Nora had cured him of that arithmetic for good. He had learned from a piece of bread that the measure of a life is not what you manage to keep safe, but what you are willing to give away, and he gave the rest of his to Nora and their children and his people, freely, with nothing held back, the way she had taught him. Years later, when the young ones asked how the fierce old war chief had come to marry the white grandmother, Nora would tell them about the hungriest winter anyone could remember, and the last piece of bread she broke in half at a famine fire. He had turned away every woman for 10 years, Nora would say. The whole camp had given up on him, and I did not set out to change any of that, little ones. I just saw a hungry man, and I had bread. That is all it ever was. Remember that. You do not know what a small kindness will undo in another person. I gave a starving stranger half a piece of bread and asked for nothing, and it brought down a wall 10 years high, and it gave me back a life I thought was over. The smallest thing, given freely in the lean season, is the most powerful thing in this world. It was for me. It was for him. It can be for you.